Hello, everyone. I'm Nick, and I'm going to talk about how we can understand each other better. You know who this lady is in the slide, probably. Kellyanne Conway, a White House spokesperson, and she did an extraordinary interview early in 2017 where she was defending some untruths that had been told by the White House press secretary. And when she was pressed on this point, she said, well, look, he was just presenting you with alternative facts. And that was the moment, I think, when we all realized something very strange had gone on in the realm of public discourse in the USA and maybe in other places as well. We couldn't rely any longer on rational discussion based on agreed objective facts. So I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about are there any ways in which we can think about this that are meaningful, and are there any ways we can think about it that are relevant to us working in organizations, working on business analysis, business change, etc. And we have this political polarization now. You can see, I'm not going to talk about these slides in detail, but you can see we've got Democrats in blue and Republicans in red. And since 1994, up until 2017, those shapes are moving further and further apart. You know, in 1994, they were very close together. There was a consensus. Now there is no consensus. And it's not just in the USA, it's in the UK as well. This chart, or these two charts, show what went on in the UK, the changes that happened in public opinion between 2015 and 2017. Obviously, something rather seismic happened during that period, which was the referendum on leaving the European Union. But you can see that the blocks of opinion there have moved apart from each other. In 2015, they were a relatively cohesive block. And by 2017, they've moved right apart. There's a big gap between them. So, yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I want to think about how we can understand this. How does it join up with what we need to consider at work? For us, when we're at work, we're generally thinking about people in organizations. We've got these three levels here. We've got the individual at the bottom, and we've got society at the top level. But we're normally focusing on organizations. Now, what I've found is that sociology is the discipline that should really tell us a lot about organizations, and it's got some stuff to tell us that's interesting, but it's psychology that's supposed to be concerned with the individual that can tell us even more about what goes on in organizations. It can also tell us about what goes on in society, and also some of the things that are saying about political science we can apply back down towards organizations as well. And there's one particular strand in psychology that I want to talk about. It's an old theory, but it's a very, very powerful theory. I think it's the most powerful theory I've come across in psychology. And it's called personal construct psychology. It was invented by this man, George Kelly. He published it in 1955. He was a psychotherapist, and the ideas have been taken up by psychotherapists in a big way ever since then. And there's been a lot of development of his theory and work on it. But for some reason, it hasn't really made the impact that it should have done in fields like business analysis, for example, where I think it's incredibly useful. People do use his work in the field of user experience sometimes, because user researchers have a bit more of an affinity with psychology as a discipline. So what did George Kelly say? What's his personal construct psychology? The basic idea, the basic metaphor is about the human being as a scientist. So he said, we're all trying to predict the future. We're all trying to anticipate things that happen in the world. And how does a person go about anticipating what happens in the world? Well, what they do is they identify patterns that they can perceive in past events. And obviously different individuals will perceive different patterns because different things happen to them, and they've got different backgrounds and different pre-existing worldviews. And those patterns that each individual perceives in the world and that they use to anticipate future events, he called personal constructs. It's like, you can imagine, it's the language that you talk when you're talking to yourself in your head. It's the way that you make sense of the world. And you've got a construct system. You know, if you look at the set of constructs that a person has in their head, they're interrelated. They form a system together. Another key point that he insisted on is that each construct consists of an idea plus its opposite. So that's why I put the picture of this sort of yin and yang symbol here. What I'm saying does have a lot of parallels with Oriental philosophy, but I'm not making a mystical point here about the nature of the world. It's actually it has a very practical significance, this, because if you measure the significance that a person gives to an idea, the weight with which they apply that idea to a person or to a situation, you can then see the strength of that construct's relationship with other constructs. So thinking of it as a spectrum rather than just a binary thing is really, really useful. And in keeping with his idea of a human being as a scientist, he said that we try constructs out and we choose the most useful ones. We see if they work. If you've ever been to the optometrist, you'll recognize this thing. It's called a trial frame, and it's how the optometrist measures the strength of your eyes. They put this hideous contraption on your head. They block off one of your eyes, and then they've got a great big box of lenses, alternative lenses, and they put a couple of those alternative lenses into that wire thing that you can see there, and they alternately hold them up to the eye that you've got left and ask you what you can see on the display at the other end of the room. And this is what we're doing all the time, according to George Kelly. As human beings, we're trying out constructs, and of course, as business analysts and consultants working in organizations, I often feel that's what we do. We're helping the organization. We're in the role of the optometrist, and we're helping the organization to look at the world through different alternative lenses. Some other things that he said: a construct can be permeable or not. So how open are you to changing your constructs or one particular construct? Or do you defend your constructs in a very defensive, rigid way? Are you prepared to change the way that you think about things, or aren't you? He also divided constructs into core constructs and peripheral constructs. So a core construct is something that's very essential to the way that you think about the world, maybe the way you think about yourself, maybe the way you think about people that are close to you. And it's very, very hard to change those things. And it's very stressful to be asked to change those things. We've heard a lot of interesting stuff about change and the way that change affects people today. And that's something that Kelly was particularly interested in. And he defined a lot of emotions purely in terms of his theory of constructs. Things like anxiety, guilt, and so on. He had definitions for them that are purely based on this idea of a system of constructs. So it's your peripheral constructs that are easier to change. We can also think of a construct and say, is it preemptive? So what that means is, if your constructs are preemptive, or one particular one is, you're not prepared to consider anything else. So it's exclusive. So, for example, earlier today, I was having a stupid argument with someone on Twitter, as you do. She had posted that she thought it was ridiculous that an organization was advertising someone to do service design and business analysis. She obviously felt that it was inappropriate, because a business analyst is a business analyst and a service designer is a service designer. And I said, well, no, this is wrong. You can be a service designer and a business analyst. And she didn't agree. So she had a couple of preemptive constructs there, business analyst and service designer. Another thing that's not great is constellatory constructs. George Kelly does use some quite weird terms sometimes. So constellatory is where your constructs cluster together into groups, and you draw conclusions from a person, draw conclusions about a person based on just one attribute. So, for example, in the United States, someone who's on the conservative side of the political spectrum might say, well, that person's a liberal, and they're talking to someone else who shares those same political views. Well, they both understand a whole load of other stuff. When they say that word liberal, a whole load of other connotations come into their minds, and they know that they're talking about the same thing as each other. And so that's the kind of process that's behind stereotyping, really. What you want a much better sort of construct is a propositional construct. A propositional construct is where you're prepared to try ideas out. It's where you say, if we were to look at this situation from this point of view, then it would look like this. But if we were to look at it from that other point of view, we would draw a different conclusion. So it's being prepared to try things on for size, which to my way of thinking is a very good idea. And that's the way of thinking that's inherent in Peter Chetland's soft systems methodology, with its idea of worldviews that this is very closely related to. But unfortunately, as scientists, we've got a few problems, because evolution has left us with some unwanted legacies that don't help us with being scientists. And one of those is that we try to avoid thinking. As human beings, we don't like thinking. It's hard work. The brain is very heavy. It consumes a lot of energy, and you've got to drink a lot of water to keep it hydrated. So it's a good evolutionary strategy to avoid thinking too much. And there was an eminent mathematician and philosopher called Alfred North Whitehead who said civilization advances by increasing the number of operations that we can carry out without thinking about them. And I think that's just so true. And one of the inventions that we've come up with as human beings for avoiding thinking about things too much is actually language itself. Language is a shorthand. Language is a thing that enables us to make sense of the world, to cluster ideas together, to use this kind of shorthand, and to stereotype things. So it's this avoidance of thinking that's behind impermeable, rigid construct systems. And it goes along with confirmation bias as well. This tendency that human beings have to perceive the world in terms of what they already know. And that fits in beautifully with George Kelly's theory. Our perceptual system is actually guided by the ideas and the constructs that are already in our head. So what I do, I've been doing this for about 10 years now. I've been drawing a type of diagram that I've made up called construct diagrams. I've since found out that someone else had a very similar idea. And it's made up of boxes joined together with lines, of course. What isn't? And the box is divided into two like this. And we put the one pole of the construct in the top half, and if there is an opposite pole, we put the opposite pole in the bottom half. I'm not precious about this. I mean, you don't have to bother filling in the opposite pole if you don't want to. And then you join the constructs together on the diagram, and you create a kind of network. So we've got a blue arrow coming in there, and we've got a red arrow coming in here. This is the reason the box is divided in two. It's because if an arrow is coming into the left or the top, it's a positive connection, it's connecting to the positive pole of the construct. And if it's connecting to the negative pole of the construct, it's in the bottom or on the right. And there's just an ordinary link going out of it there. And I use blue and red if they're available. You know, if I'm using a diagramming tool that's got color in it, then that's another way of just making that information easy to digest. This type of diagram is quite similar to a causal loop diagram that they use in system dynamics, which you may very well have come across. And in system dynamics, you put a plus and a minus at the end of the line instead of making it blue or red, or, you know, to one side of the box. But I find it makes it easier to read this way. So what types of things can we model with these diagrams? First thing is, what things are there out in the world? What categories are there out in the world we can classify people with, situations, and how are those things interrelated? And that's what George Kelly was all about. That's what psychotherapists do using his method. And there are some tools he gave us to elicit this information from people. What are the things and categories that are in their heads? And the most well-known one is called a repertory grid, which is a very structured method that you can use. You can do quantitative analysis of it to understand the ways in which the constructs are related to each other. So I would call that ontology. Ontology is what things are there in the world and how are they related. The next thing is what factors tend to lead to what types of outcome, and also how can we go about achieving our desired outcome, and I refer to that as causation. So, you know, why do things happen? And this is the type of thing that's modeled in causal maps, also known as cognitive maps. This other person I just mentioned is a man called Colin Eden, who wrote several books you may have come across, and he invented a method called SODA, which is quite obscure, but I don't really know why, because it's very good. And it helps you to, thinking this way and using these diagrams, help you to run workshops, for example, with stakeholders, when you want to develop a vision, a way forward through a situation. We could do this or we could do that. What are they, you know, how's it going to pan out? And you can also attach probabilities to the links between the items. So there's two things: ontology, which is George Kelly, causation, people like Colin Eden. But there are a couple of more things you can model as well. So we can also model how might we or someone else persuade other people to do something or to think something. And that's what I refer to as rhetoric. So this is an overlay on the diagram. You look at the boxes and lines that you've done and say, okay, so this is one person's construct system. And you could draw the other person's construct system. You can aggregate them together into a group construct system, hence the name group construct analysis. And that is basically modeling the discourse that's going on in the organization or in the group or in the society. And you can contrast models with each other, and you can use that structure that you've got there and that transparency to make decisions about how to communicate and understand, you know, how people are trying to persuade us and how people are persuading other people about things. Also, the final aspect, again, this is an overlay on the model. How powerful is this construct in this person's way of being? So I refer to that as valence. So how powerful is this? Because we all know that there are some ideas that are just people's hot buttons. An individual has hot buttons, a group has hot buttons. And when you're talking to people in an organization, you know there are certain words that are like trump cards. If you play that card, you're going to be okay. You know, when I used to work in investment banking, it was profit. You mentioned profit, you're okay. When I worked in a public sector organization, the buzzword was accountability. You say that word accountability and you're going to persuade the person. So at the end of the day, constructing a rational argument on the basis of facts is quite unimportant when you're trying to persuade people. You've got to take into account the valence of the different constructs. Another unfortunate legacy from our evolutionary past, you tend to be successful in winning a mate if you can impress them with your power. So it's more important to win the argument than to be right. And that's the way it is. We like to think of ourselves as very rational creatures, but it's more important to show our power than to be right sometimes. And equally, humans are not inherently predominantly rational beings. They are social beings. One of the most essential concepts in social psychology and sociology is the concept of in-groups and out-groups. And this idea of in-groups and out-groups accounts for just so many aspects of human behavior. And having a belief is often a matter of belonging to a group. It's not a matter of rational thought. We deliberately believe something because we want to believe it, because by believing it, we're saying who we are, what group we belong to. And we gravitate towards people who think like us. Anything else is threatening to us. And because we spend all our time talking to people that are like us, we become even more like them. And social media aggravates this in a number of ways. And of course, the wide choice of news outlets that we've got these days, and the personalization that's available makes it worse, because we only consume the news and the information that we want to consume. So when we're using rhetoric, there are various tricks that we can use to change the narrative. It's all about changing the narrative. It's about changing the subject. It's about finding the pressure point, and drawing these diagrams helps you to do that. You can look on there and say, okay, what's the construct that I can base my argument on? What's the lever I can pull here? There are lots and lots of examples I could use to illustrate that, but we're not going to have time to. And you can either do that honestly, transparently, or you can do it dishonestly. You can kind of change the subject while pretending you're not changing the subject. And that's what we see a lot of today from politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. People changing the narrative by reframing the issue in a dishonest way. There is so much more I want to talk about on this. Honestly, I could literally talk about this all day. But that's all I'm going to say for today. Thank you very, very much for listening. I'd really like you to get in touch with me, either in the board, or later on you can email me, get in touch on LinkedIn or Twitter. And one thing that I'm thinking about doing is running some workshops, either in October or November, or both, where we can talk about this stuff and try it out in practice. So I'd like to hear your views on, is that a good idea? How long should they be? What should we cover, etc. Thanks very much for listening.